Welcome. My name is Dr. Dan Lesham, and I'm the director of the Kupferberg Holocaust Resource Center and Archives right here on our campus. I encourage you all to come visit us. And we are the sponsoring organization for this KHRCA Colloquium series at which you all find yourselves this morning. And this is our inaugural event for this year's program. The USC Shoah Foundation, an organization I used to work with, is remarkable for having collected about 52,000 testimonies from Holocaust survivors around the world in the late 90s. These testimonies were about 2 hours long, videos of survivors, and in which they were asked to tell the story of their whole life. It's called a life history interview. And then the testimonies were watched and indexed. Someone added keywords to the testimonies. Well, about 3 years ago, the Shoah Foundation decided to research how prevalent an issue sexual violence was during the Holocaust. So we're all very familiar with, or some of us are, with the broad strokes of the Holocaust, the massive numbers of Jews that were rounded up from Europe and sent to ghettos and then to concentration camps, and some further in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union that were never rounded up but were killed by mobile killing squads. And so the historians, cultural memory has tended to look at the numbers of people who were killed and the issues of being isolated from families, having your human rights, civil rights stripped from you, being herded into ghettos, being transported by cattle cars. That's the kind of typical experience we understand. And for a long time, it was believed that, for the most part, sexual violence wasn't really an issue in the Holocaust. In fact, people argued that Jewish women who went to concentration camps and other places were not raped, ever, and that was a result of the very clear orders the German authorities gave to their soldiers not to. But other scholars who for a long time have noticed the prevalence of sexual violence and especially rape in all genocides throughout history had even started to wonder if you can look at rape happening around the world as some kind of predictor for where genocide might break out. That there was such a high correlation that it could even be used to predict it. So the Shoah Foundation decided to do some research. Let's see if we can determine, using our own testimonies, how prevalent this issue was during the Holocaust. Like I said, the Shoah Foundation had 52,000 testimonies, and with a very quick search, they found over 2,000 of those testimonies mentioned sexual assault or rape on the person sharing the testimony, or them describing, this having happened to someone they knew well in the camps or in the ghettos. So far from never happening, it occurred fully in 2,000 testimonies. Now, like I said, these are 2-hour stories of someone's life. So what that means is that in that 2 hours, 2,000 people felt that it was important enough to mention it. And think about trying to tell the story of your whole life in 2 hours, and you are much younger than these survivors were, who were mostly in their 70s. Given 2 hours to tell the story of your life, how much you have to leave out. Then think about, if you were going to tell the story of your life, what would you include and what would you exclude? Certainly, we don't like thinking about, much less talking about, the most horrible experiences that happened to us. So it was reasoned that if 2,000 testimonies have people discussing sexual assault, how many more could have discussed it but didn't, either because of the amount of time they had or because they didn't want to shame themselves or others, they perceived that that would be shameful, or for a variety of other personal reasons. And the Shoah Foundation came to an educated guess that probably 10 to 15% of all the testimonies it had captured had that as a part of the story. So as you're going to hear today and over the course of this year, where we're examining the question of what role does gender play in the experiences people have in episodes of genocide and mass violence. How does gender shape that experience? Now, I must say that in the Shoah Foundation study, there were also men that experienced sexual assault and rape. It was a much, much smaller number, but it also occurred. And so today is the first lecture of what's going to be a very interesting year of 8 lectures, exploring this topic from a wide variety of different perspectives, not only about the Holocaust, but about a lot of other historical episodes of mass violence, eruptions of trauma, and mass atrocity. I really want to thank President Call, who I saw earlier somewhere here, for her support of the center, helping the center get this NEH grant, which now funds forever, in perpetuity, we say, these annual series of lectures. I want to thank Amy Traver, who's this year's coordinator, Dr. Amy Traver, and I want to thank also Dr. Elisa von Joeden-Forgey, who is today's speaker from Stockton University. And I want to thank all of you. I want to thank all of you because there were lots of things you could have done with your club hours today, but you chose to be here. I want to thank your professors that helped incentivize that, but I also want to thank you because these aren't easy topics to think about or to talk about, but they're crucial topics for us to think about. These are meaningful conversations, and they don't just relate to the past. This topic of sexual assault has been most in the news recently relating to college campuses. Not this one, but as it occurs on college campuses across this country. These issues affect us today in our world. And we use the Holocaust and the history of other genocides simply to have a good historical moment to explore, but not to say that this is something that happened in the past that isn't related to our present and that won't be in all of our futures. This is something we continue to struggle to address, and I take it as a wonderful sign that you're here because that says to me that you hope to be engaged. You want to learn, you want to be educated and ultimately motivated and energized to help think through these problems in our societies today. So I'm very inspired by you, and I want to thank you all for being here today. I also want to tell you that the Kupferberg Holocaust Resource Center and Archives has lots to offer you. We offer our own internships. We have mini courses. We have exhibits. We have events. I see a lot of you picked up the calendar of events for the fall. Please come back, talk to us, join us in our work. We'd love to have you all as partners. So, without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to this year's faculty coordinator, whose insight, energy, and really just sheer unadulterated talent have been inspiring to me, even in the relatively short time that I've known her, Dr. Amy Traver. Thank you.
We have a full room. That's really exciting and wonderful. And I'd like to add my thanks to Dan's for all of you for being present today. This is the first event of the 2015-2016 colloquia series, and the title of that series is Gender, Mass Violence, and Genocide. The remaining 7 events are open to you. They're free. They're different in form and function, and I know they'll be as enriching as today's talk will be. As Dr. Lashem mentioned, my name is Amy Traver, and I'm an associate professor of sociology and education at Queensborough. And I know some of you, but I look forward to getting to know some of you as well. In my capacity as the coordinator of this year's colloquia series, I've had the distinct pleasure of working with and learning from many talented individuals committed to understanding, and as today's guest will argue, potentially preventing incidents of mass violence and genocide through the application of a gender lens. Given that this is the first event in the 2015-2016 series, I think it's appropriate to begin by defining the three concepts and phenomenon that ground this series. After all, the very design of the series ensures that some of us have very working and early understandings of the topics we'll talk about. So for the concept of gender, we'll draw on sociologist R.W. Connell, who defines gender as the structure of social relations that centers on the reproductive arena and the set of practices that bring reproductive distinctions between bodies into social processes. In regards to mass violence, we'll draw on the work of Jacques Semeline, who defines mass violence as human phenomena of collective destructiveness that are primarily due to political, social, religious, or cultural causes committed against non-combatant populations. And then finally, we'll draw on Article 2 of the UN's 1948 Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, which defines genocide as acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, national, ethnical, racial, or religious groups. With these definitions in mind, I ask for your help in welcoming today's speaker, whose work really inspired this series. Dr. Elisa von Joeden-Forgey is Assistant Professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Stockton University, not very far away in New Jersey. She's also there the director of the Masters of Arts in Holocaust and Genocide Studies program. She's an expert in modern German and African history, as well as issues related to the Holocaust, genocide, human rights, war, and imperialism. Those of you interested in her research can find her work published in such diverse and significant venues as the Journal of Genocide Studies and Prevention, the Oxford Handbook on Genocide, and the forthcoming collected volume, Economic Aspects of Genocide, Mass Killing, and Their Prevention. Dr. von Joeden-Forgey is currently working on a book about gender and the prevention of genocide, which is set to be published by the University of Pennsylvania Press. Her talk today is a preview of this important and timely publication. So please join me in welcoming her today.
Thank you very much. At the outset of this talk, I would like to express my deep thanks to Dr. Traver, Dr. Lesham, to the Kupferberg Holocaust Resource Center, and to Queensborough Community College for giving me the opportunity to speak to you on the topic of gender and genocide studies. It is a real honor to be included in this important initiative, which will be bringing in a host of truly illustrious scholars over the coming academic year. And I can't encourage you enough, right, to come to more of these lectures. Looking at the lineup, it's really very exciting, and I'm tempted to drive up from Stockton for each one myself. Dr. Traver has just offered you three very important definitions, not simply for this program, this program this year, but also for the study of genocide, right, itself. And they are at the heart, these definitions are at the heart of some of the most animated debates, in fact, in the field of genocide studies today. These debates revolve around core questions in the study of genocide, some of which we will engage directly in the next hour, and certainly you're invited to ask questions about any of the ones that I don't directly engage in my talk. And three key questions that come out of these definitions include, one, what is the definition of genocide? For those of you who've done any research on genocide or taken a class on genocide, you know that there are myriad definitions, right, proposed by various scholars that exist in excess of the Genocide Convention's definition. The legal definition, which is the Genocide Convention's definition, which was set out in 1948, right, has been questioned for its adequacy, right, especially as a tool for conducting research and thinking about prevention over prosecution. So by and large, the legal definition has been used by international jurists to push for prosecution. So the question becomes, is it adequate, right, for our purposes? And then if not, what is, right? What is an adequate definition? How do we go about defining what genocide is? The second question that comes out of these definitions is, what is the difference between genocide and mass violence? Or what is the position of genocide within this larger concept of mass violence? Is it perhaps better to use an all-encompassing term like mass violence for the research that we do, because it captures a wide variety of gross human rights abuses, right? Or do we still need the specific term genocide? So is there some value added to using the term genocide, right? This question really became important, or became central to many debates in genocide studies during the Darfur genocide. So at the outset of the Darfur genocide in 2003, 2004, where some of you may know, the United States, after conducting extensive research amongst refugee populations, right, determined that Darfur was a genocide, and the UN, also conducting extensive research amongst refugee populations, determined that it was not a genocide. And then there ensued a debate about whether or not these atrocities, these tragedies that were occurring in Sudan and in East Africa, if these constituted genocide or not. And many people felt this debate was untoward, right, unnecessary, and preventing actual useful engagement with, right, prevention and humanitarian relief efforts in Sudan. So terms like mass violence, mass atrocity came to take the place of genocide. And then the third question that emerges out of these definitions is, what does gender do to genocide, right? Is it merely an aspect of what we study? So is it just sort of a new subject within the larger complex topic of genocide studies? Or does gender-sensitive research into genocide fundamentally challenge our definitions of the crime and our assumptions about what this crime is, right? So I want to start today talking a little bit about how I see the relationship between genocide and mass violence. And this is by no means the final word on the relationship between genocide and mass violence, but it's important for me to state this at the beginning so you understand the specific nature, right, of what I'm talking about today and what my work engages. So as Dr. Traver mentioned, mass violence is a term that we usually imagine to mean physically destructive events, right, in a clearly demarcated period of time. That period of time can be long, right, but the mass violence is extensive and noticeable over that period of time. So a riot can be a form of short-term mass violence, as can a massacre. A war is a form of longer-term mass violence, and a government crackdown on protests can be both short and long-term. In my research, I view genocide, right, as part of a trajectory of mass violence, but as a process that almost always results in mass violence if allowed to follow its own logic. But I also view genocide as a process that is distinct from many other forms of mass violence, right? So I see genocide as distinct from what are called the other big two, right, international crimes. You have the big three international crimes: war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, right? I think these distinctions are important, and I believe that genocide is different from war crimes and crimes against humanity and the mass violence processes that lead to those, although all of these processes always overlap, right? So in other words, I believe that genocide has a very specific historical trajectory of its own, one that can express itself over the long term in forms of violence that do not really meet the criteria for mass violence, right? Sometimes these forms of violence that result in genocide as mass violence, right, are not really mass in nature. They start out very localized, right? Sometimes they are not coordinated, right? They're popping up in a society very early on, before anybody's even planning genocide, right? And sometimes they are not even visibly violent or physically violent, right? So these are sort of the echoes of genocide before it becomes a plan. These stages in the development of genocidal processes would be overlooked, right, if we simply use the framework of mass violence for examining genocide, right, or as our model of genocide. And so as someone who works in prevention, right, I need to look, or I like to look at the long term. As we see from this legal definition, genocide, in fact, must not necessarily involve mass violence at all to be identified and prosecuted, right? It's a crime of intent. In the present convention, genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, right? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So as a crime of intent, it is really the thought that counts, right? So, strictly speaking, a person could be accused of genocide simply for forming intent, for thinking it up, right? Even if he or she has not yet acted upon that intent. Now, this is, of course, all theoretical. Naturally, it's quite difficult to identify genocidal intent in a person, much less in a group, without some actions being taken, and any efforts to do so would look like thought policing, right? I mentioned the issue, this theoretical issue of genocidal intent, more to show that genocide can be something small, right, in the mind of one person, before it becomes something large. So the mass dimension of genocide is something we see only towards the end of the process. If we get stuck in the end game, then, how are we to understand what got us there and how we can avoid it in the future, right? So for me, genocide's a very specific thing with a very specific history that happens again and again and again. It's very equal opportunity, right? And it can happen anywhere, as we've seen in our historical studies. Because of this specificity, genocide, in my view, has important long and short-term red flags that we can pinpoint and act upon. When I'm looking at these things, I do not see so much a form of mass violence as a pattern that is guaranteed to result in mass violence if it's left to its own devices, right? So look for the small, right, in order to potentially imagine the large that it could become. For example, today I will discuss briefly cases of genocidal policies that fall outside of common definitions of mass violence, either because their violence is not coordinated and expressed in a clearly collective way, or because the violence does not primarily involve physical destruction, so meaning basically killing, right? And this brings me to gender. A very simplified definition, and we'll get to R.W. Connell's definition that Dr. Traver gave at the beginning in a moment. But a very simplified definition of gender is that gender is a socially constructed category, I'm sure you all have heard that terminology, and a set of relations that revolve around physical sex differentiation, right? So gender is what separates humanity into boys and girls, women and men. And this separation is today what we call and critique as the gender binary, right? When we look at genocide in terms of gender, certain things become visible that are harder to see without gender-sensitive research, right? And one way to think about this at the outset here is to examine the legal definition itself. The legal definition, as most laws, is usually treated as a definition that itself has no gender, right? It's a law, right? So it doesn't have a gender itself. Gendered subjects are not identified as part of the 4 protected categories. And here you see the 4 protected categories: national, ethnical, racial, or religious groups. They're called the protected categories. So gender's not mentioned there. Nor is gender explicitly mentioned in the 5 acts here, right, that can constitute the crime of genocide. But there are ways in which this definition is indeed gendered. I will give you an example. Most genocide scholars in crafting their own definitions of genocide, right, have focused on Part 2A of the Genocide Convention when defining genocide. 2A stipulates killing members of the group, right, as an act of genocide. So genocide in these definitions is basically mass murder. Genocide is mass murder, right? In drafting scholarly definitions, it is killing that also gets the most attention, right? So we talk mostly about killing. And this is precisely because when genocidal processes are left to their own devices, they usually result in mass killing, right? And then, of course, in mass graves. Nevertheless, there are these 4 other acts of genocide that are incredibly important to the crime, to its history, to its nature, to the effect that it has on victims, and the long-term effects it has on society after, right, the genocide is declared over. And these are B, C, D, and E that you see up here on the monitor. Gendered research into genocide calls our attention particularly to these last 4 acts of genocide, right? And this is so for several reasons, 3 in particular. First, by bringing to the table the possibility that men and women experience genocide differently. And this is a phenomenon that the Holocaust historian Myrna Goldenberg has referred to as different horrors, same hell, right? Men and women experience genocide differently, but they're all stuck in the same horror, the same hell, right, together. By bringing to the table this possibility that men and women do experience genocide slightly differently, gendered research has surfaced crimes that have not been considered to be an integral part of the genocidal process until recently. And the most, I think, significant of these crimes is the crime of rape, right? Now it's hard to talk about genocide without talking about rape. And rape can fall under, right, B, C, D, and arguably in certain cases E, of the Genocide Convention, and in some case law, right, has been actually tried according to those aspects of the Genocide Convention. So a second point is that gendered research brings in what we call the domestic sphere, right? By forcing attention on women. And of course, men are gendered subjects too. We women are not the only ones who are gendered subjects, right? We're all gendered subjects, but gender research is really what brought women into the narrative about first the Holocaust and then later genocide. It has also brought in the domestic sphere. And what's that? That's the space where families and smaller communities, right, are targeted and overrun by genocidal processes. As we can guess from the wording of the last 4 acts of genocide, causing serious bodily and mental harm, deliberately inflicting conditions of life calculated to bring about physical destruction, imposing measures to prevent births, and forcibly transferring children, as we can see from that wording, much of the violence of the crime of genocide takes place in the intimate world of the physical and the symbolic domestic sphere. And by that, I really just mean the smaller, right, the local and the regional that gets caught up in genocide. So instead of looking at the macro, right, gender-sensitive research can call our attention to more micro processes. Third, gender-sensitive research tends to be more critically engaged with explaining why people are treated in certain ways and how they end up in one place or another, right? So why are women treated differently sometimes? Why? Right? Why are men treated differently? Why are perpetrators behaving in this way? Why do perpetrators do those things? Why do they do those things in different ways based on their gendered assumptions about their victims? Why is this happening? There is a historical angle to much gendered analysis in order to explain these phenomenon, because our gender categories develop and gain meaning over time. So in any society, gender categories change, they shift, right? And they certainly become entrenched and develop meaning through history. So looking at genocidal processes over time can bring into focus all sorts of genocidal policies that exceed genocidal killing. And indeed, these policies often precede and then follow the killing, the mass killing stage of genocide. They are aspects of genocide that reach deeply into the peace before the mass violence and then extend into the peace after the mass violence. And yet they're often overlooked. So I would suggest that the Genocide Convention, rather than being a gender-neutral document, is in fact a gendered document that has also been read in a gendered way. By focusing on mass killing as the main criteria of genocide scholars, in their definitions at least, have erased at the conceptual level the very important experiences of men and women, boys and girls, before, during, and after the mass killing in their local, their family, their community contexts, right? So one way to summarize the contribution of gender-sensitive research to genocide studies is to say that it shines a light on how much of the crime of genocide involves the domestic sphere, and this is what R.W. Connell calls the reproductive arena. So now we're back to the definition Dr. Traver gave us at the beginning. You all have heard this definition. I'll read it again. Gender is the structure of social relations that centers on the reproductive arena and the set of practices that bring reproductive distinctions between bodies into social processes. A simple way to put this is that gender is the way human collectivities make meaning from the fact that some people's bodies can birth children and some people's bodies can't, right? As you might expect, the process and the space of birth giving, of bringing new people into the world, of reproduction, is a central concern to the perpetrators of genocide because they want to bring the reproduction of their targeted groups to an end, right? Or to a halt. Often perpetrators view reproduction in both biological ways, so the physical act of bringing new children, right, new people, and cultural ways, so the way that societies or groups of people reproduce their language, the way that they reproduce their customs, the way that they reproduce their religion, right, their social institutions, their universities, right, their holidays, right? So perpetrators use this idea of reproduction, or it seems to be operative in their thinking, right? Both about the biological realm of reproduction, but also this much larger community level social reproduction of the group. And the tactics they use to destroy biological reproduction often mirror the ones they use to destroy cultural reproduction. So, for example, without getting into details, pregnant women are often desecrated in ways that are similar to the desecration of important religious and cultural institutions. So you see a link in the minds of the perpetrator between biological, physical reproduction of children, right, and the social reproduction of the group at large. Opening up the smaller and more domestic sphere for consideration, gender-sensitive research calls our attention to 4 things about genocide specifically. One is that genocide involves widespread rape and sexualized violence. And this, in fact, has led the feminist legal scholar Catherine McKinnon to argue in a very good article called Genocide Sexuality that the concept of power, the very concept of power operative in the minds of perpetrators, is a sexualized concept. And this is why we see so much rape and sexualized violence, because it's a useful model for perpetrators to use, right, when declaring and demonstrating their power over their victims. Secondly, Genocide involves the intentional separation of families. In almost any genocidal process, you will see families intentionally separated. In part, that's a pragmatic issue, right? It makes the work of genocidaires a lot easier. But there's also evidence that perpetrators do this in order to transgress, right, family bonds and close commitments that family members have to one another. Genocide also involves gender-based violence against reproduction. So pregnant women, as I mentioned, are often the target, right, of violence. But there are all sorts of other forms of reproductive violence, right, that go hand in hand with genocide. And genocide involves very, very starkly gendered patterns of destruction. And one of the persons who has worked most on that, named Adam Jones, will be coming, right, as part of this series. And so I definitely recommend his talk. Some key patterns of gendered destruction during genocide include the following. Gender-neutral mass murder, right? So mass murder of women and men. We saw this in the Holocaust, for example. It's characteristic of what we call total genocides, or ideological genocides, genocides where the perpetrator wants to destroy a group in whole rather than simply in part, right? Wants to get rid of every possible member, right, of the group that they can reach. So gender-neutral mass murder, characterized by gendered forms of torture before mass murder. So a research done by various scholarly institutes on the mass killings, right, that occurred during the Holocaust at the early stage of the Holocaust, like the Babi Yar massacre, maybe you all have heard of, have shown that there were all sorts of gendered atrocities that occurred at the sites of these mass killings before people were directly murdered, right? There's a very good book that outlines some of this called Holocaust by Bullets, right? So this predated the gas chambers, the stationary gas chambers, right, and the death camps. We also see sex-selective mass murder, what Adam Jones calls gendercide. So a good case of that is, for anybody who knows about the Bosnian genocide, is the massacre of men and boys in July 1995 in Srebrenica, right, by Bosnian Serb forces. Women and young children and very, very aged men were sent, what was called by the Serbs ethnically cleansed, out of Srebrenica, and men and boys as young as 10, so the so-called battle-aged men, that was defined very capaciously, right? So we have victims from 10 to 7 in their late 70s. About 8,000, over 8,000, were massacred then, right, in an act of gendercide. This was determined to be genocide, right, in 2 separate court cases, the logic being that when you destroy that high number of men, most of whom are still in their reproductive age, right, in a group which the pre-massacre population of Srebrenica was estimated to be about 40,000 people. If you destroy 8,000 of the men and boys in a group of 40,000 people, you're essentially compromising their reproductive capacity for long enough into the future that this is an act of genocide. So that was part of the logic there. So gender-selective mass murder, gendercide, can be an important act of genocide in and of itself, or it can be part of a wider process of genocide, which we also saw in the Bosnian case, where it sort of culminated smaller acts like this, very gendered acts, that had occurred for 3 years prior to that. Mass sexualized violence also is a pattern in genocide. We now know that most genocides, and Dr. Lasham mentioned this earlier, right? Most genocides are characterized by rape and sexualized violence of some sort or another, not simply against women and girls, but also against men and boys. And there's some indication that in genocidal processes, the number of men and boys that are raped increases, right, from the number that generally get raped at times of war. Of course, we don't have good documentation of this, so it's hard to say that, but that seems to be one thing that's coming out of the research, is that mass sexualized violence against men is higher or more intense during genocide. Forced maternity, I don't know if you guys know this term, but this was very characteristic of the genocide, the wider genocide in Bosnia, where women were raped by mostly Muslim, and then some Croat women were raped by Bosnian Serb soldiers, who then, in a sort of erroneous reading of genetics, right, seemed to think that they were inserting into the Bosnian community little Serbians, right, that would sort of destroy the community from within. So women, Bosnian Muslim women, were forced to they were kept in these rape camps until they either gave birth or it was too late for there to be any, for them to get an abortion. And this is referred to as forced maternity as an act of genocide. Also, we see the rape and enslavement of women and children, and the killing of battle-aged men, right? So when you see this pattern happening these two patterns happening in tandem, they can be a red flag for a genocidal process. Men are being treated one way, they're being killed, often because they're seen as the more dangerous members of the group, the least vulnerable, right, to other forms of destruction. And women and girls and children are raped and enslaved, right? This we see today. Does anyone want to shout out where we're seeing this process today? The Congo, yes, in smaller scale. You have different groups possibly committing genocide. Yes, that's right, in Congo. Syria, yeah, by ISIS, exactly, yeah. So Congo's definitely one way to look at that, and then ISIS in Syria. We see this pattern developing or expressed there too. Less often, right, another model is the direct killing of women, right? Because they bring new children into the world, so in that way they're very dangerous if you want to destroy a group. And the killing of men through work, right? Because they might as well be used as slaves before they die. This is a rare form. Raphael Lemkin, who we're going to talk about in a moment, who's known as the father of the Genocide Convention, right, and really is the father of genocide studies, saw this in sort of the depredations of Genghis Khan, for example. So it may be an older model, but it's something to look for, right? And then life force atrocities, which is a term that I use in my own research, which I define as a ritualized pattern of violence that targets the life force of a group by both destroying the physical symbols of its life force, as well as its most basic institutions of reproduction, especially the family unit, right? Life force atrocities include inversion rituals that seek to reverse proper hierarchies and relationships within families, and thereby irrevocably to break sacred bonds. Such acts include forcing family members to commit rape against one another, right? Forcing family members to watch the rape, torture, and murder of their loved ones, and forcing them to participate in other sorts of crimes against people they both love and feel responsible for. Life force atrocities also include the ritual mutilation and desecration of symbols of group reproduction, right? Including male and female reproductive organs, women's breasts as the site of lactation, pregnant women as the locus of life force of these generative powers, right? And infants and small children as the symbols of the group's future. In fact, this kind of targeted cruelty against infants and small children is one of the key characteristics of genocide, right? So whenever we see targeted attacks against infants and small children, who are arguably some of the most vulnerable members of our communities, right? Then we should see some red flags as well. Now, these inversions and desecrations can be committed on a larger scale, so not just at the family and the small community level, against a group's formative institutions and symbols, but they follow the same logic, to strike at the heart of what gives a group its identity and what accounts for its life on this planet, right? So perpetrators of genocide are not simply motivated by practical, pragmatic concerns. They also have their own ideas, right, about what constitutes a group, how are groups formed, and they seek to destroy groups based on those ideas. In my view, life force atrocities are some of the most telling signs of genocide. When we hear about them in a conflict, we can be quite sure that genocidal intent, right, or what's becoming genocidal intent exists somewhere among the combatants or the military and political hierarchy. So if you read this stuff in the newspaper, right, you can be sure there's something related to genocide going on in the conflict. So looking at ISIS, for example, we see so many of the gendered patterns and life force atrocities that I've just discussed, and it is these things that can help us identify genocide, even at an early stage. Now we're not so much at an early stage for ISIS anymore, but we can see these things at an early stage of the violence as well. So, for example, much of the early stage violence committed in Syria by Syrian security forces involved these sorts of life force atrocities, which should have been or could have been a tip-off that his response to both political and then later armed opposition was going to be immeasurably cruel and relentless, right? So the signs were there that this was not going to be a self-limiting conflict in Syria, and part of those signs were these life force atrocities. Now, one of the few scholars to integrate gender into their definition of the crime of genocide is Helen Fein, really one of the doyens of genocide studies. And she defines genocide as sustained, purposeful, that means intentional action, by a perpetrator to physically destroy a collectivity, directly or indirectly, through the interdiction of the biological and social reproduction of group members. So that's what I've been talking about here, right? Sustained regardless of the surrender or lack of threat offered by the victim, right? So for her, this kind of attack on the reproductive capacity, both biological and social, of the victim group is key to her definition of genocide. Her work in the 1990s, so she wrote this in 1993, was really trailblazing, and it has taken quite some time for it to be taken up by scholars. So it's only really in the last decade or so, maybe the last 15 years, that scholars have begun to take this approach to genocide more seriously. And what is interesting, however, about Helen Fein's definition is that it is very much in line with the original thinking of Raphael Lemkin, right, whom you might know as the father of the Genocide Convention. Lemkin, who lost 49 members of his family in the Holocaust, right, worked tirelessly from the time that he was a young Jewish lawyer in Poland to his death at age 59 to bring genocide to the world's attention. He is credited with being the motive force behind the Genocide Convention, right? So there's really one man behind the Genocide Convention. Many different people came together to make it a reality, but he's the one who pushed for it, right? So he's credited with being the motive force. And it is hard to dispute, really, that we owe its existence to his Herculean efforts to pressure UN delegates and make the case that genocide is not only the crime of crimes, right, in as much as it targets everything about us that's human. It targets us on all levels, right, of our humanity, but also that it's a crime requiring its own legal mechanism and specific preventative measures. There were people at the UN after the Holocaust who were arguing that the declarations of human rights, there are two, would cover the crime of genocide because the discrete crimes committed, right, and named in these two declarations were also committed, right, during times of genocide. And Lemkin said, no, this is such a complex process that draws together various human rights abuses. It needs its own convention. It needs its own law, right, because it's an identifiable thing unto itself. And if we treat it discretely as simply acts against individuals, we miss the point of the perpetrator intent, which is to kill off a group, right, or destroy a group in whole or in part. What is less known about Lemkin, right? And anybody who's interested in reading more about Lemkin should read Samantha Powers' book, A Problem from Hell, where she details sort of the lack of effective US intervention in cases of genocide in the 20th century. But she has a wonderful chapter on Raphael Lemkin, if anybody's interested. What is less known about Lemkin is that he was quite attentive to gender in both his published and his unpublished works on genocide. This is very interesting if you think about the mid-20th century when, there weren't gender scholars, right? There weren't second wave feminists looking at this sort of thing. He was very, very attentive to it, which I think can be explained by the fact that genocide is so gendered. He couldn't ignore it in the evidence he was looking at, right? So if you look at his historical works on genocide, which have only been published in pieces up to this point, but really weren't known well until about 5 years ago, he specifically mentions rape, sexual mutilation, the brutalization of infants, the disembowelment of pregnant women as forms of genocidal violence, right? So he saw those and he discussed them, and when they were in his evidence, he mentions it. It appears in his historical work. In his published study of Nazi atrocities, of Nazi policies across occupied Europe, which was called Axis Rule in Occupied Europe and was published during World War II, it's a very interesting book. Important chapters of it are available online, so if you search it, right, you could find the chapter on genocide, specifically on genocide, where he coins the term. The term didn't exist before Axis Rule in Occupied Europe, right? He invented the term. He mentions these techniques of the Nazis, right, as constituting genocide. The separation of families, we just talked about that. The malnourishment, the intentional malnourishment of parents, because that makes them less effective parents. It makes them less capable of raising their children, right, and conveying their culture to their children. Marriage controls and bans, right? So the Nazis were making it illegal to marry for certain groups. The criminalization of biological reproduction, right, which we saw across occupied Europe, particularly in reference to Jews, right? It was illegal to have children in ghettos, for example, and certainly in the death and concentration camps. And policies of anti-natalism and pro-natalism. And what's meant by that is that Lemkin believed that if the Nazis were taking measures to increase the birth rate among so-called Aryan Germans, right, and then alongside that taking measures to decrease the birth rate amongst Europe's Jews, but then also other groups too, like Poles and Gypsy, the Roma Sinti, right, that those two things in tandem were a highly genocidal phenomenon. So in his list of genocidal laws, there includes like welfare laws directed at Aryan families, right? He saw that as genocidal because they were aimed at increasing the birth rate of the perpetrator group, right, at the expense of the target groups. So, apart from being integral to the crime of genocide since its inception, gender is also something that was recognized by the man who coined the term, who prepared the initial drafts of the Genocide Convention, and who inaugurated the historical and sociological study of the crime of genocide. So this goes back to the idea that the Genocide Convention is a gendered document, right? He doesn't mention apart from separation of families, right, through the removal of children, the Genocide Convention doesn't mention specifically any of these points, but they're there, right, and they're interpretable through the other 5 other acts of genocide listed. If we look at the gendered research on genocide as a whole, I think the crime of genocide itself comes into focus in a new way. Central to it appears to be the reproductive realm of the targeted groups, right? So when we look at all of this together and the different voices that have been contributing to the study of gender, including Raphael Lemkins, it looks like genocide is about gender in many ways, right? And because of this, I would like to offer today that we begin to view genocide as a form of reproductive violence, right? So not only is it a form of mass violence, it's also specifically a form of reproductive violence. And by reproductive violence, I do not mean solely violence committed against people's biological reproductive systems, right? That's part of it for sure. But I mean also reproductive violence in the wider sense. Violence committed against people's abilities to form stable and lasting relationships, right? To express love, to enact protection, to develop thriving communities, to control the disposition of their own bodies and the bodies of loved ones. Reading the memoirs of survivors of genocide, it is immediately apparent that all of these facets of the deepest and most meaningful part of our human life are relentlessly targeted when genocides are in full swing. Mass murder may be the end result of genocidal processes, but in the process of getting to mass murder, the perpetrators torture victims at every conceivable level of their identities and commitments, right? For this reason, a historian named Dirk Moses, a historian of genocide, and particularly genocide in Australia, has called genocide a total social practice, right? So what happens is that perpetrators attack communities in totalizing ways, every level of their communal life, right? And that goes for the individuals within those communities as well as community institutions. In fact, genocide can be committed without any direct killing, right? This is something we usually don't think about. We usually think there's some direct killing in genocide. But as an example, I want to offer the stolen generations in Australia. Some of you may already know about this case. The stolen generations refer to children who were forcibly removed from their families for being what were called by the state half-caste, meaning having one white parent and one Aboriginal parent. Half-castes were sent to residential schools where they were not allowed to speak their native languages and were taught to forget their families and cultures. For the most part, these children never saw their families again, and their families never saw them. In the 1930s, there was, as scholars have argued, there was a distinctly genocidal intent to this child removal program. The racialist theory at work at that time was that half-castes could be bred with white Australians this was the terminology, to breed out the color within a few generations, right? Creating fully white families then out of these half-castes. Because the belief that the so-called full-blooded Aborigines who were left behind when the half-castes were removed, because the belief was that these were prehistoric people that were naturally dying out due to modernization and the modern age, child welfare officials hoped that by separating out and breeding out the color of half-castes and by leaving Aborigines to their own devices, that they could create over time a fully white Australia with no indication that Aborigines had ever occupied that land, right? So that was the ideology in the 1930s. This episode in Australian history has been retold in really a wonderful film called Rabbit Proof Fence. Has anyone seen that film? It's really good. I suggest it. I think it's available on Netflix. It's available on Amazon for instant streaming, I believe. It's a very, very good film. And the director has something to say about the genocidal process, and he depicts this episode in Australian history. And in particularly, he mercilessly depicts the pain and suffering caused by forced child removal. It sounds kind of, right, uneventful, child removal. But he shows how deeply scarring and how deeply traumatic that process is, both for the removed children and for their family members who have lost them. He looks at this, I believe, as sort of a microcosm of larger genocidal destruction, right? Even though there was no direct killing. Now, it should be said that at some of these schools that the children were sent to, conditions were horrible, and they did die, right, of diseases, right, or exposure and other things. But the killing was not direct. We did not have, at this point in Australian history, in the 20th century, massacres, right, as part of this policy. Now, the Australian case resembles, of course, the Canadian residential school system, which maybe you all have heard more about, which the Canadian Truth and Reconciliation Commission recently called a cultural genocide. So these genocides without direct killing are being recognized, right? There is a growing literature recognizing them as genocidal processes. And in the United States, where we have yet to have an official reckoning with our past, Native peoples are starting to bring more and more attention to the history of Native child removal policies, which in places like South Dakota, for example, continue to this day. In South Dakota, Native Lakota children are 10 times more likely to be removed from their homes than white children, and 90% of those removed from their homes are placed with white families off of the reservation in contravention actually of federal law. So the Indian Child Welfare Act makes this illegal, and yet somehow in South Dakota 90% of the children are transferred to foster parents outside of the reservation and outside of the Native community. Now, Lakota activists have called this genocide, as we see here, to stop the genocide of Indian children of South Dakota. And they view it as a continuation of genocidal policies set in place during the period of Western expansion in particularly the 19th century in the United States. Whether or not we wish to call child removal, in this case, a case of genocide right now here in the present, right? So whether or not we decide that this is genocide going on right now, it cannot be avoided that it is also a long-term after effect, right, of genocidal policies that sought to undermine the reproductive capacities of Native groups through myriad tactics, including killing. Right? So at a time when there were myriad massacres against Native peoples, there were other tactics in place as well that sought to destroy Native reproductive capacities. And this, of course, sets up a habitus in any society where those sorts of policies can extend well past the massacre stage. And this raises a question. What does a potential genocide look like in peacetime? How do we identify that, right? What are peacetime genocidal patterns? This is one of the critical questions of genocide prevention. And it is one reason that it is important to remember that genocide does not always take on a mass quality, especially when it exists in the minds, ideologies, speech acts, and smaller scale crimes of potential genocidaires. So it's not always mass, right? Sometimes there are policies that leave countries or societies vulnerable to genocide that don't have a mass quality, may not have genocidal intent, but can certainly lead the way, right? Or create the conditions for a disaster in the future. So we can see genocidal patterns in ideologies, mindsets, speech acts, policies, political platforms, propaganda, hate crimes, and so forth across the world. Not all of these things, as I just said, will lead to genocide. Genocide is never, ever inevitable, but these things can be viewed as red flags. Now, some of the gendered characteristics of genocidal ideology, right, and now I'm talking about the way gender has influenced our view of perpetrator aims, right, and perpetrator thinking, include the following. A kind of zero-sum economy of generative forces, the idea that if that group gains, right, my group definitely loses, right? There can be no shared gains. One group's gain is my group's loss, always, right? Equally, my group's gain must be their loss, right? So this is this zero-sum economy of generative forces, right? Control over reproduction. So we've talked about some of those policies. Forced pregnancy and maternity, on one hand. Forced abortion as well can be genocidal. Forced marriages, marriage bans, criminalization of reproduction. Different genocidaires take different policies, use different tactics, because it's all about the control of reproduction within the victim group as well as the perpetrator group. Pronounced sexism and misogyny, you see that throughout genocidal ideology, even genocidal ideologies that claim to be gender neutral. So for example, in the Cambodian genocide, right, the Khmer Rouge allowed women into its ranks, allowed women to sort of work their way up the ranks, right? So it was not on the face of it sexist and misogynist, right? But it also launched an attack on the family structure in Khmer society, such that families were actually banned, and any show of tenderness to a family member could actually get you killed, right? So in that way, you see a kind of sexism and misogyny directed at family systems, and particularly at women in family systems. State or armed force appropriation of the parental role, right? A lot of genocidaires will talk about themselves as the father now of the community, right? The Khmer Rouge saw itself as the mom-dad of Khmer society. In Argentina, right, the military junta talked about itself as the new parent of a new society. In Nazi Germany, right, the National Socialists, the Nazi Party, began to erode family bonds through the use of youth groups, right, and other institutions that challenged the familial role and claimed those children for the party itself. And so you see this kind of appropriation of the parental role amongst genocidaires. Definition of enemies as reproductive threats. Enemies are often seen in genocidal ideology as posing a reproductive threat. They're rapists, right? Or they lead women to prostitution, or in one way or another, they're narrated as reproductive threats. Definition of enemies as being incapable of having families. This was a problem for Native peoples around the world. They were believed not to have stable family systems. This is one of the reasons you still see forced removals of children, right, in parts of the world. And it's believed to be easier to take children because those are not stable family systems anyway, right? And then the violent sexualization of enemies as well, right, is a key characteristic of genocidal ideology. Now, given the role that gender has in constructing genocidal ideologies, it is perhaps not surprising that many genocidaires have felt excluded from this reproductive realm. So the research we have on perpetrators is suggesting that many of the architects of genocide are what we can call threatened elites, right? They believed they should be able to occupy some role in a patriarchal system, and then something's keeping them from occupying that, and they blame their target group. So genocide is about them claiming that space that they believe they're entitled to, but somehow aren't getting, right? And so studies of the architects of genocide, people like Adolf Hitler, have suggested this, gendered studies of the architects. And studies have also suggested that some of the people most vulnerable to genocidal incitement, right, most vulnerable to being attracted, right, to or co-opted by small genocidal cadres, groups committing genocide, are young men who feel they don't have access to land or to jobs that would allow them to create families and then occupy a position of status, right, and honor within their own societies. So that's another body of research out there, gendered research out there on perpetrators, which brings into view the question of genocidal masculinities, right? So increasingly we have work looking at what kind of gender identities, right, can help lead to genocide, right? How much does this have to do with our gender identity? Here's a picture of Arkan, who was the leader of a particularly feared Serb militia that committed genocide in Bosnia. Now, raising the question of genocidal masculinities then also raises the question of genocidal femininities. Here I have a photo of women concentration camp staff, right, taking it easy. And there's a new book out by a historian named Wendy Lauer. I don't know if any of you have read this book, called Hitler's Furies, where she looks at the over 200,000 women who were sent by the Nazis to occupied territories, particularly in the East, to help out with the project of occupation. And she finds that amongst these women, many of them voluntarily gave themselves over to committing genocide, including voluntarily giving themselves over to direct killing of children, right? So she has sort of laid to rest any question we have about women's capacity to commit violence. And there will be actually a lecture in this series, I think, on perpetrators, right? Gender and perpetrators, yeah. Okay. So we see a picture emerging of genocide as a very gendered crime. One could even say that genocide is a crime about gender, inasmuch as it emerges from reproductive realms, defines its targets according to reproductive obsessions, aims to control and destroy reproduction, and creates long-term patterns that undermine reproduction. And as a consequence, and this is in conclusion, I believe it is essential that we also understand reconstruction, reconciliation, and prevention in the wider rubric of reproductive justice, right? So if genocide's a crime of reproductive violence, its prevention and its healing after the fact, right, can be a process of reproductive justice. Survivors of genocide, as we know, are often alone in the world, the solitary witness to the destruction of extended families involving the young, the old, and everyone in the middle. When families or parts of families have survived genocide together, they have often experienced extended tortures, implicating their deepest bonds and loyalties. When rape and other forms of sexualized violence is a pronounced feature of genocide, and it usually is, families may be torn asunder by the physical and social sequelae of such violence, so the after effects of such violence. In fact, rape, sexualized violence, and domestic abuse often proliferate after genocide, in part as a direct consequence of the complex trauma caused by the crime of genocide. So in addition to the transnational justice mechanisms that are being devised by international and domestic NGOs across the world to deal with reconstructing societies after genocide, I think we need to be sure to work to reweave, right, the broken fabric of family and community by emphasizing people's reproductive justice and people's reproductive rights. That is, their rights to create families of their choosing, to raise children in safe and healthy communities, to express familial and communal bonds according to their own traditions. This is not an easy task in the wake of genocide. For one, it requires the critical analysis of social and political structures, policies, and dynamics that made a society so vulnerable to genocide in the first place. So after the killing, we really have to think about what got us there, right? And as I'm suggesting about genocide, critical analysis of this type will necessarily raise really unpopular issues, such as issues related to gender norms, gender hierarchies, gender identities, and gender rules. So it's essential that we involve grassroots groups and local NGOs to lead the way in reweaving this broken fabric. Even though this work is hard, such deep structural engagement is necessary to lasting peace, and the future of our world may depend upon it. Thank you very much.
So we learned a lot today, right? And we have a lot more to learn. Lots of references. Thank you very much for those. And we have a lot of work to do. Let's begin that work by asking questions of our speaker today. Perhaps there are certain cases that you can think of that are relevant to some of the red flags. I can certainly think of quite a few domestically that we're seeing today and have seen in our not so distant future. One note is that you've been given a evaluation survey. I hope it doesn't distract you from asking questions of the woman that we're here to learn from. But it is necessary for the funder, the National Endowment for the Humanities, who has supported this series for the last couple of years and whose generous support of the series, as well as the generous support of Queensborough donors, will continue the series in the future. Okay? So please, we have microphones. We're ready for your questions and the opportunity to learn from you. Hello? No, okay.
The children in Australia, do you know what happened to them?
Yes. Many of them never saw their families again. So those that were taken early on in the 20th century were kept when it was harder to get around, right? Were kept in conditions, even after they left the residential schools, in working conditions that made it very difficult for them to get back to their home society. So many of them never saw their families again. Some did. Some were able to make it back. Rabbit Proof Fence, the film, chronicles the story of three children who escaped, right, the residential schools and made their way home by foot, one of whom was captured along the way, but they then had their own children later on taken from them. So it was a relentless system of child removal. So even those that made their way back were in no way safe, right, from this policy. It was ended in the 1970s, and it was that generation and the subsequent generation that have called attention to it in Australian society. And Australia has engaged in a very painful and at times conflictual, right, back and forth about this issue, right? Yeah, you want to follow up on that? Yeah.
This has something a little bit different
Yeah.
from the issue, but are children that are taken from their families often, are they recruited and put as soldiers?
That can not, yeah, this is not Australia, right? No. That can happen. There are there's a certain kind of militia model that we've seen in wars like Sierra Leone, Liberia, right? Or the Lord's Resistance Army in Eastern and Central Africa, where children have been taken by the militias, so they've been kidnapped by the militias and then forced to become, yes, a part of those militias. They're often then, and you've probably heard about this, they're often made to go back into their home communities and kill people there or commit atrocities against people there so that they can never be reintegrated, right? So it's another way to undermine. And so I think that those kinds of militia models have distinct genocidal qualities to them. So we may not call the civil wars, right, or the internecine warfare that results genocide, but there are distinct genocidal aspects to that. And the removal of children, the kidnapping of children is definitely, for use as child soldiers, and sex slaves, right, is definitely one. Did you, there was a, yeah.
I mean, I guess it's kind of the same question. I was going to ask specifically to these children in Australia.
Yeah.
What happened to them when they grew up? Like, were they able to have their own children, put in the same school? What happened to them as adults?
Yeah, I mean, there were a diversity of situations. Many of them never made it home. As I said, they didn't speak their language anymore. This was a problem in US residential schools and Canadian residential schools as well. If you take children early enough and keep them until they're teenagers or of age, they'll no longer speak the language of their home communities, right? Which can make reintegration very difficult. But in Australia, it was actually their movement was limited. Their right to movement was limited. And so they often didn't end up at home. Their children were often taken from them, right? The kind of breeding schemes and the forced marriage schemes didn't really pan out. The men were often put into jobs as physical laborers, right? Low-paid physical laborers, and the women as domestic servants. So that was kind of the path, right? The standard path for many folks. Now, some did go back, right? And they've become activists around this cause, right? And they've begun to try and reconstruct, right, what was lost through this process. Yes.
Hi, my name is Adam Ludke. I'm a professor of political science here and your former colleague at Stockton. This is in part to help my students who have to write a paper about this and are here. What can law enforcement authorities, whether international or national law enforcement systems, do better in terms of preventing gendered war crimes, crimes against humanity, and possibly genocide?
That's a really good question. And I think one of the most important things we can do in terms of genocide prevention and in terms of using international and domestic law enforcement is to treat genocide forensically. Right? So to look at it as a crime like any other, even though it is the crime of crimes for many, and even though it is a gross abuse of human rights, right? And even though it is such a complex and enormous process, there are distinct actors in genocide. They're distinct perpetrators, right? They share communication. They often share ideas across genocides. We have known factors, right, who are committing this kind of violence. And if they could be followed and traced, right, and potentially apprehended for smaller crimes, not necessarily for genocide, right? Arms trafficking, rape, right? If they can be apprehended for those things and tried for those things, that gets them off the streets, so to speak, right? And it gets them out of the business of organizing genocidal processes. So, you know, for example, the two men who led the war in Sierra Leone and the war in Liberia both trained together in camps in Gaddafi's Libya. They knew each other, they worked together, they were tied to Gaddafi. Gaddafi also trained in those camps the Janjaweed militias that committed the atrocities in Darfur. The atrocities in all three of these cases, Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Sudan, are very similar, right? So they're not acting in vacuums. They're known quantities. And if we can trace them better, I think, if international law enforcement and domestic law enforcement can have just a better tracking mechanism, right? In countries like the United States, that would include simply tracking domestic terrorists better, for example, right? Or people committing hate crimes better, or groups inciting violence better. That sort of thing, I think, is crucial to preventing genocide, and indeed could possibly, when done smartly, nip these vulnerabilities, right, in the bud and strengthen a society's capacity to act against genocide or create anti-genocide institutions, right, and policies that promote peace as opposed to vulnerability, right? Yes?
I don't know if you have the answer for that, but I was wondering, like, why some country with power, like they often let genocide to happen. For example, the Rwanda genocide.
The Rwandan genocide? Why countries, do you mean like countries outside of Rwanda allowed genocide to happen?
Like the US, like other countries. They could like stop that.
Yeah, it's frustrating. It's frustrating, and it's a complex answer, and in each case it's slightly different. One of the problems is, you know, politicians aren't necessarily the best people to look to stop genocide because the stakes are really high. And the US at that time was very afraid of some Somalia-type situation, right, which becomes a domestic embarrassment. And so it's a kind of lack of political will is one, right? Another is that we don't have strong enough protocols that flip into action when there's a threatened genocide. So we have early warning systems now. We didn't, right, for the Rwandan genocide. So there was no official database, right, that suggested certain early warning criteria. But we don't have protocols. What do you do when you see that early warning, right? So there's a kind of dithering that comes out of a lack of focus and knowledge, right, about what to do. Then, of course, in the Rwandan case, there is the question of sort of a callous indifference to the lives of people so far, in the case of the United States, so far away, right? People have accused the international community of racism in the case of Rwanda because there was so little attention paid to that small country in the center of Africa. So there are a lot of complex reasons, right? All of which suggest is that we need to somehow bolster political will, but also expand the range of options open to politicians, right? And UN member states when they're looking at looming genocide. So can we get in there before you need to send in boots on the ground? That's what everybody's afraid of, military intervention. It's often a debacle. It doesn't always work. Sometimes it can, right? In the case of Rwanda, the general who was there, Romeo Dallaire, who was head of the UN mission there that was supposed to keep the peace, believes that boots on the ground could have stopped the genocide. That's been vetted by various military strategists, and it seemed to be, his plan seems to have been a good one. So in that case, maybe it would have worked, right? In the case of the Srebrenica massacre, maybe it would have worked. Maybe some kind of military intervention when that massacre was looming and the red flags were going up, maybe it would have worked. But we really need to give politicians very clear ways to engage before military intervention is necessary. So thinking backwards, once it became known that the Hutu power extremists in Rwanda were stockpiling machetes, and this was something that was known months in advance of the actual outbreak of the genocide, that would have been a good time to take action. That would not have required an expensive and politically dicey military commitment, right? It would have been more kind of a police action. And it's things like that seem to hold the most hope. Diplomatic and criminal justice interventions, right? Rather than military intervention because it's impossible to get countries to commit to that. And now with the situation in the Security Council, the UN Security Council, as some of you may know, there's just such a stalemate in making any decisions that certainly the decision to militarily intervene in a situation is going to be impossible to come to, right? And we saw that with Syria. Right? It's that kind of great power wrangling has meant very little has been done to ameliorate the situation in Syria. So I hope that helps to answer the question. It's complicated, and I think the takeaway is let's devise better protocols. Let's devise more protocols to offer politicians, right, in preventing genocide that don't require military intervention. It's a good question.
And if I can ask the final question?
Yeah.
What can we do as we bear witness to what's happening in Syria and Iraq with ISIS? What can we do to put pressure on the politicians to make the very changes and take the actions that you referenced?
Yeah, that's a tough question, right? Because we don't know what politicians are going to do with public pressure. And it's not clear to me what kind of intervention now at this point would be the best sort of intervention, right? So I think it is important, however, always to write to you, everyone says this, right? To write to your Congress people, say this stuff does matter to me. Foreign policy matters to me. The lives of Syrians, of Iraqis matter to me. Certainly putting pressure to allow in more refugees. If we can't stop the conflict, we can at least help people get out of harm's way. So certainly doing that, right? Committing locally to helping refugees is another way to go. Giving money to organizations that help refugees is a way to go. And just voicing your concern that politicians in the world, not just in the United States or your home country, right, but in the world in general, really, really focus and begin to prioritize genocide prevention over the long term. And that really means that all of us need to take a very, very close, critical look at the societies in which we live for any potential red flags, because societies don't know decades out that they're going to end up embroiled in genocide. You talk to people who were bystanders or witnesses, and often it seems to have come out of nowhere, or at least have radicalized in a very short time frame, right? So apart from putting pressure on those who have power, we all have power in our own domestic spaces, right? And we can help to decrease those tendencies that could go in the total wrong direction when there's a crisis or when a certain political group decides to take advantage of these vulnerabilities to impose their own genocidal goals, right? So that would be my answer to that difficult question. Yeah.
And we so appreciate your time.
Thank you all so much. I appreciate you so much coming. Thank you.